Are there prophecies about an ascension contained within Buddhism? Do these prophecies include the arrival of a messianic, Christ-like figure that they call Maitreya? Do these prophecies also have very, very similar characteristics to what we see in Hinduism and even borrow some of the same words? Are there concepts of creation and dissolution? And is it possible that there were some misunderstandings in the original version of Buddhism about the length of these cycles and when these events will take place? And is it also possible that when Padmasambhava, the second Buddha, arrived in Tibet, that he actually showed us how to ascend and demonstrate it and had 160,000 other people do as well with their rainbow body teachings? This is some of the most exciting information that I can share with you, and I can't wait to bring it to you today. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to start to talk about these lesser-known aspects of Ascension scholarship. If you want to try to understand what happens with Buddhism, you have to dig a little deeper, because there is some confusion in the Buddhist scriptures. There are holdovers from Hinduism, and that is a very important point that we need to start with here. Buddha himself was a Hindu. Buddha grew up in a Hindu culture. He was born in a very wealthy Hindu family, and they lived in their lush palaces, and he had never seen suffering before. All he knew was opulence and wealth and amazing abundance. And then he grew disillusioned, and this is interesting. It's an archetype that seems to strongly parallel the story of the creation of the universe itself, where the universal creator had everything it could ever want, but which we would now call planes of existence and then galaxies in those planes of existence. Those components all have their own free will. So they are one with that creator, but they also have separate free will that's distinct from the one infinite creator as well. So Buddha's story, I believe this is not an accident, parallels that archetype beautifully. He goes out into the world and he experiences and he sees suffering, something he had never seen before. He's looking at these people who are impoverished, who are starving, who are hungry, and he didn't even know that such a thing was possible. He'd grown up his whole life in pure abundance. So that created his amazing awakening experience where he meditates under a tree, the so-called Bodhi tree, and has these great realizations about the nature of human existence, and it is rooted in the idea that we are suffering when we are here, and he called that samsara, and that there is a key to overcoming suffering, which is to see that this is only an illusion. We're not living in a truly manifest world. There is some greater identity that we're all a part of, and that greater identity is what he would call nirvana. And so the nirvana is the state that you can aspire to in meditation, and if you stay in that state long enough, if you stay meditative long enough, then you no longer need to suffer. You've discharged your karma. Karma is a Buddhist concept. It also is a Hindu concept, but it carries over into Buddhism, as do many, many Hindu things. So that is a really important point. These Hindu scriptures heavily influenced Buddhism as we now know it. So I want to quote to you now from this journal from April 1974. It was the Philosophy East and West Journal. The article is called The Buddhist Conception of Time and Temporality by David J. Kalupahana. And so what we're going to see here is very, very important stuff. I'm just going to give you some bullet points from it. The Hindus' word for time is kala. And in the Hindu concept of time, time is seen as not only being the cause of the universe, time caused the universe, but it is also an all-pervading principle that governs everything in the universe. Now that is quite a meditation in and of itself. And it actually mirrors nicely with Kozyrev and Russian physicists, as I've talked about in older episodes of this show. Time governs the universe, and time is an all-pervading principle that the whole universe is formed from. The universe is an illusion made of time. Time somehow runs things, and of course in Hindu scripture it's all about cycles, and those carry over into Buddhism as well. So let's keep reading. The Jains, which came after the original Hindu text but before Buddhists, the Jains and others later saw time as one of the causes that are actually determining the course of natural phenomena. So the Jains would look at things like how plants are growing, and they would see all growth as a product of time. Growth is something that occurs because of time, and therefore time is propelling growth. Natural phenomena, things growing and evolving, is a product of time moving through them. It's a very interesting realization, and guys like Dr. Nikolai Kozyrev and the whole Russian physics branch, they really have stuck to that and even extended on that theory and that model well beyond what we see in Hinduism and Jainism, because they did it with science. But let's keep reading. This is really interesting stuff. Buddha realized in his own enlightenment that everything is being causally produced by time. That's a very important point. It's an illusion. In his own enlightenment that everything is being causally produced by time. That's a very important point. It's an illusion that is impermanent. Everything in the world is impermanent. And Buddha also believed that the beginning of the universe was inconceivable. Anamataga, that's the name he gave for it. Now, that actually mirrors what is in the Law of One. The Law of One says that the universe started in mystery, that this universal mind cannot fully be understood. There is mystery in its origin, and there is mystery in its completion. So Buddha seems to have nailed that part very, very nicely. Despite an inconceivable beginning, we witness periods of evolution, or vivata, and dissolution, or samvata. And this is going to become very important because those two periods, vivata and samvata, are the key of the whole thing, evolution and dissolution. The periods of vivata and samvata play out in terms of eons. Well, we know what that is. Eons are cycles of time. And so creation, evolution, dissolution, all these things play out in cycles. In Buddhist terms, these eons are called kappa. That's how it's said in this 1974 paper. It also is written as kalpa, either one. So a cycle is a kappa or kalpa. Now this is where I really catch interest, because when I did the research, I discovered, oh my gosh, the Buddhist term samvata is exactly derived from the Hindu word samvartaka, because as I showed you before, the word samvartaka also sometimes is shortened, and it is shortened to samvarta or samvata. So samvata in Buddhism is the word for the samvartaka fire. And the Hindus had it very clearly that there were ages, there were cycles, and that at the end of the age, it gives off its thing. So that carries over directly into Buddhism. Now what's weird though, is that Buddha does not nail down that there's going to be a samvartaka fire in the near future per se. He does predict a Messiah coming, but there is some lack of clarity about the length of these cycles in the surviving Buddha texts that we actually have. So this is one of those things that probably is a misunderstanding that I'm trying to smooth out for you so you can see how well everything fits together, because again, the word samvata is in Buddhism, samvata vivata. It's right there, where you have evolution and dissolution happening at the same time. The samvartaka fire creates dissolution, vivata, but it creates evolution at the same time. Actually, vivata is evolution, samvata is dissolution. So that flash, it is dissolving and it is building at the same time. And it depends again on which timeline you're on. So that duality, the word samvata vivata, carries over nicely into Buddhism, and it's really mentioned quite a bit. And it all ties back to the solar flash. The largest kappa in Buddhism is the Mahakappa, also called the Mahakalpa, and this appears to be what we would call the 25,000-year cycle. The ending of a Mahakalpa produces an apocalypse that can happen in Buddhist teaching in one of three ways. You have either water, fire, or wind. Well, look, there it is. The solar flash obviously is going to create all three. Fiery emanation from the sun. You're going to have the winds that are caused by the earth moving on its axis. And you're going to have the water that's caused by the flood. So this, again, makes sense because Buddhists don't really discount Hinduism. Buddha didn't throw it in the trash. he just added didn't throw it in the trash. He just added some things to clarify the original understandings, to bring it back to a monotheistic concept, a universal mind, instead of a pantheistic view, to see more in depth about meditation and about the importance of unifying your own consciousness with that universal mind, to really kind of refine and clarify this. But the Hindus are really big on asceticism and renunciation of the material world. That carries over perfectly into what we see in Buddhism. So there's a lot of parallels between Hinduism and Buddhism, obviously for good reason. So this thing about the Mahakalpa, the major cycle, it ends in an apocalypse of water, fire, or wind. And again, usually it's all three. So all of the key components that we're looking for carry through into Buddhism, and a lot of people may not even realize this. That's why I'm pointing this out to you. And they also see the Mahakalpa as dividing into 4 quarters. Now, there's different ways that we can divide the 25,000-year cycle. And the Mayan calendar is one such division. 5,125 years is exactly 1/5 of it. So if you divide the 25,000-year cycle into quarters, you're getting a little over 6,000 years per cycle. And there are certain views of this 25,000-year cycle that do look at it as I've said before, the great year. And the great year is broken up into 4 seasons, just like the regular Earth year has 4 seasons. And each of these seasons has a quality associated with one of the 4 elements: earth, air, fire, or water. And of course, in astrology, you're going to have planetary signs that would either be one of these 4 qualities. So the signs and the planets, it's all interrelated with these elements. So if you have a regular year that's going to always have one of the 4 elements associated with any sign, the great year is the same way. So all of this Buddhist stuff lines up very perfectly with the idea of a great year divided into 4 seasons, and all that we've been hearing about before, this idea that there is a catastrophe at the end of the cycle involving water, fire, or wind, or some combination of those 3. It's all there. Buddha's ideas, however, of these time cycles are inconceivably vast. And in that sense, there is a contrast with all the other schools of thought that we have investigated. And however, there is a prophecy of a messianic figure who arrives in a cycle change at the end of a kappa known as the Maitreya. And we're going to get back to that Maitreya in a minute here. But I want to just say something about these inconceivably vast cycles. Buddha he doesn't really refer to this very much. He only refers to it a few times. But he has some very strange analogies where his view of the kappa, or the kalpa, this cycle, is like basically the length of the entire universe. So he talks about things like if you had a huge cube of stone, and once every 100 years you brush a piece of silk against the side of the stone, that before you would ever be able to fully brush, you would have to be able to fully brush that giant stone all the way down to nothing with the silk every 100 years before you would add up to the length of a kalpa. So he's basically meditating on infinity and the idea that the universe is infinite. And it may be that in order to confuse us a little bit, when Buddha was channeling in this information, for that particular time, at that particular place, he wasn't being given specific information about the solar flash. When he meditated on the kappa, at that particular place, he wasn't being given specific information about the solar flash. When he meditated on the kappa, or the kalpa, he saw it as the length of the universe. So he created these fanciful metaphors that are very trippy and give you a lot to meditate on, but it's a meditation on infinity. It's a meditation on how time is going to go on for so long. And it seems in some way that the original Hindu meaning of Samvartaka kind of got lost, and yet Buddha got this download on the Maitreya, this messianic figure that's going to be like him, and we'll get into that in a minute. But I want to explore now a little more detail on this Samvata Vivata principle and how it carried over. And we're going to look at this book from 1905, the Pali English Dictionary by Davids and Seed. And we're going to look specifically at their definition of the term Vivata. And their term for vivata is rolling back with reference to the development of the world, or the eons kappa. So this rolling back, again, you got to think about this in terms of a big, big event. Rolling back is a literal translation of Asian language, but it's a very, very big concept. It's literally the rolling back of the veil. Vivata is evolution, it is creation, it is new birth. The rolling back of the veil means you're no longer veiled from knowing that you have a soul, from knowing that you've had multiple lifetimes, from knowing that there is a one infinite creator, and from having a direct personal experience of that one infinite creator in your being. The veil is rolled back, and this again is tied in with the word samvata, which is the flash from the sun. It is used to denote a devolving cycle or devolution, whereas vata alone or samvata denotes including Hinduism, they talk about the breath of the compassionate or the breath of the divine. There is this idea that the human body is holographic to the cosmos, and therefore we have a heart in our body that beats and it expands and contracts. And that expansion and contraction pumps lifeblood through the body, which is essential for our survival. And it is the fact that holographically the universe is doing this. There are cycles within all things. Atoms are pulsating in much the same way. And as we're going to see in later episodes, stars are pulsating. They actually get larger and smaller in a regular breath-like motion, which we can measure. We know this is happening. And that is a very important point. All of the sacred geometry that I've been talking to you about in previous episodes is ultimately a pattern in 3 dimensions, like the dodecahedron, which is 12 pentagons. Those patterns exist in water. If you have water and you vibrate it with the sound frequency, you get these beautiful geometries, and that's Dr. Hans Jenny, the science of cymatics, which I've talked about here many times. So you get these 3-dimensional shapes, but the way that you're ultimately going to create those is by a central oscillator. In the center of wherever this bubble of fluid would be, you have one little guy, this little sphere that's expanding and contracting. That's the breath. That's what they're calling in Buddhism sambhata vivata. It gets larger and smaller, larger and smaller. The waves then create interference patterns, which are that geometry, these force fields. The geometry is simply a sound wave, but the origin of the wave is a breath-like motion. So all of this gets back to sacred geometry, and I've showed you before in Tibetan Buddhism that they have mandalas. They say the universe was formed this way, and they're talking about the breath. So clearly, some type of advanced extraterrestrial intelligence was at work here. So clearly, some type of advanced extraterrestrial intelligence was at work here, because now we know that this is how that geometry is made, and the geometry the Tibetans showed us is the same geometry now being discovered by these guys from Caltech when they see what all quantum mechanics in the universe is emanating from. That there's one little Merkaba, and the entire universe is just an emanation from that one geometry. That means it's breathing. So the Buddhists totally nailed that down. That's Buddha's meditation. He really was onto something here. Let's keep reading this definition now. Thus, as periods of the world, samvata vivata, these 2 terms practically mean the same thing, and here's the key: they may both be interpreted in the sense of a new beginning. So remember, Buddha inherited the term samvata from Samvartika fire, and that term means a new beginning, the rolling back of the veil. The sun does its flash, there's some sort of release of energy that rolls back this knowledge that we were kept hidden from. We now see the truth for the first time. We understand that we are immortal. We understand that we have everlasting life as a soul, and ultimately that we are part of one cosmic identity. And samvata and vivata, evolution and dissolution, they all happen at the same time. It's all part of the new beginning of the earth. And remember, this is in the Buddhist dictionary that we're getting this from. Now let's continue. We sometimes find vivata in the sense of renewal and samvata in the sense of destruction, where we should expect the opposite meaning for each. So both terms have them inside of one another. Vivata is both renewal and destruction. It's the giving of life and it's the taking away of life. Samvata is destruction and renewal. And it all, again, ties in with this solar flash that Samvartaka fire goes into great detail about. Wait a minute, Nibbana, yes, that is the same word as nirvana. And it's just how it was anglicized. The original word is nibbana. But then English-speaking people said, oh, nirvana, yes. So you can see how these kind of misunderstandings took place. The word nibbana, though, doesn't seem to have the same oomph that nirvana does to us because we've heard the word nirvana said so much. But the idea here is that this vivata, when the sun does this, when samvata leads to vivata, leads to this new creation, it is the absence of samsara. That veil that keeps us in samsara, as Buddhist describes it, that's taken away. And what you're left with is a state of nirvana. So that's really cool because Buddha's twist on the solar flash is that it propels us into what he calls nirvana. That is the key of the samvata vivata experience. Now we're going to quote from the Pali Canon Buddhist Dictionary because we get a little bit more on vivata that's important here. In this case, it says it is the absence of the cycle of existence, the standstill of existence, another name for nirvana or nibbana. So the absence of the cycle of existence, the standstill of existence, well, wait a minute. Yes, just like we saw in the Muslim scriptures in the previous episode, it is where time stands still. Time comes to a halt. So once again in Buddhism, we get the same thing. There is no more time as we know it. Nirvana is a timeless type of state. And that's really cool. The absence of the cycle of existence. We're no longer feeling it the same way that we did before. So now, as I've been saying, samvata vivata could be another term for that solar flash. And the Maitreya, Buddha predicted, would appear at the end of the same way that we did before. So now, as I've been saying, samvata vivata could be another term for that solar flash. And the Maitreya, Buddha predicted, would appear at the end of the cycle. So he totally nailed the same thing that the Zoroastrians called the Saoshyant. Now, this again, some of this came from Wikipedia, but it's all very clear. Maitreya is a bodhisattva, which is an enlightened being, who will appear on earth in the future. This is in several Buddhist texts where Buddha predicts this, that Maitreya will achieve complete enlightenment and he will then teach the pure Dharma. In some Buddhist literature, such as the Amitabha Sutra and the Lotus Sutra, the Maitreya is also referred to as Ajita. Now, before we go any further, let me just be clear that many, many, many individuals, going back for well over 1,000 years, have tried to say that they are the Maitreya. It's a very common thing for people to try to say that they are a messianic being. It's also a common element of schizophrenia. In fact, it's so common that they call it Christ complex, and it's normal for a schizophrenic to believe that they are some kind of world messianic savior. So you're probably going to see people out there trying to say they're the Maitreya. I would take that with a grain of salt because the original Buddhist description of this would be a being who would have all of the cities, all of these amazing magic powers ready to go. Let's keep reading now. The prophecy of the arrival of Maitreya, this is what Buddha set it out to be, refers to a time in the future when the Dharma will have been forgotten by most people in the terrestrial world. Well, that absolutely fits with exactly the time that we're in now. So this is an example where Buddha's insight, in my view, tuned into who we are and where we are right now and exactly what's going on. The name Maitreya is derived from the Sanskrit word Maitri, or loving kindness, which is in turn derived from the noun mitra, or friend. So Maitri, to be loving, to be friendly, and to help us understand this new way of being. One mention of the prophecy of Maitreya is in a Buddhist text called the Maitreyavyakarana. And this mention of the prophecy of Maitreya, it implies that he is a teacher of meditative trance sadhana, that's just a meditative practice, and states that gods, men, and other beings, and now we're going to have the quote, this is what the Maitreya says he will be able to do for us, that once this event happens, we will lose our doubts and the torrents of our cravings. A torrent means a flow, like a very violent flow of water usually. The torrents of our cravings will be cut off. We lose doubt. We're not craving material world anymore. Free from all misery, we manage to cross into the ocean of becoming, That sure sounds like ascension. And as a result of Maitreya's teachings, they will lead a holy life. No longer will they regard anything as their own. They will have no possessions, no gold or silver, no home, no relatives. So this is interesting. Now, it kind of sounds like John Lennon's song, Imagine. Imagine no possessions, all this kind of stuff. I'm not saying that relatives are bad, okay? Let's just be clear on this. But what it is prophesizing is that we are so awakened into the heart of who and what we are that everyone becomes like our family. Everyone is in love with everyone. Nobody hates anybody, and that is very consistent with how the Law of One describes the post-harvest or post-ascension world. That in that world, it is just incredibly blissful, compassionate. And so Buddha was definitely given the download. He had the right terms. He had Samvata Vivata. He had the Kalpa, the cycle, the Mahakalpa that ends with a fiery event. And he has the emergence of a Saoshyant or Messianic type savior, a Maitreya. So isn't it interesting that these scriptures from various religious texts, savior, a Maitreya? So isn't it interesting that these scriptures from various religious texts all seem to have Messianic figures showing up? They talk about a solar flash. There's so many parallels. The only little tweak there is that when Buddha was meditating on what Samvata meant, he apparently didn't have the pedigree that the people in the original Hindu texts had. Remember, in the Hindu texts, it appears that extraterrestrials were openly walking among us much more than in Buddha's time. And everybody talks about, oh yeah, the Yuga fire at the end of the age. The sun does its thing, Samvartika fire. By the time Buddha was reading these texts and heard about this, that society where everybody knew about it as if it was a given, that wasn't there anymore. So I do believe that when Buddha meditated on it, the benevolent force working through him didn't say something apocalyptic for our immediate future. It talked about much longer cycles, and yet he's got the Mahakalpa, he's got the Maitreya, he's got the transition into a new age, he's got creation and dissolution happening at the same time, Samvata Vivata. It's all interconnected, and this prophecy says that we become this enlightened society where we're not attached to possessions anymore. We have spiritual insights, and we all feel totally in love with one another. Now let's keep reading the rest of it. But they will lead the holy life of oneness under Maitreya's guidance. They will have torn the net of the passions. They will manage to enter into positive trance states, spiritual trances, and theirs will be an abundance of joy and happiness. For they will lead a holy life under Maitreya's guidance. That sounds very good. And then, as this text goes on, this is not from Buddha anymore, but this is from the text that was writing about it. Maitreya is said to reside in the Tushita heaven, which is Tusita in Pali. And the Tusita heaven is said to be reachable. Gautama Buddha also lived in the Tushita heaven before he was born into this world. He was already in the ascended realms. All bodhisattvas live in the Tushita heaven before they descend into the human realm to then become Buddhas. So that is where nirvana comes from. That is the whole concept. And I don't really think that we got the full Buddhist download until the time of Tibet. And I've talked about this before, so I'm just going to round out this episode by giving you a little bit of a reminder of exactly what we've learned now that I've showed you how Buddha downloaded the core of it. And I think the second Buddha, Padmasambhava, comes in and he refined it even further. So as I've said to you before, Padmasambhava is a being who clearly seems to be drawn as having penciled on a mustache, possibly penciled on his eyebrows, and he very clearly is never shown without a hat on, so he might not have any hair. And that would suggest that Padmasambhava was an extraterrestrial. Remember, the word Padmasambhava means lotus-born, and it was said that he came in from an egg from the sky, and that he was just born out of this egg that flowered open like a lotus. And then that would clearly indicate somebody that was an extraterrestrial human, plus he doesn't seem to have any hair, and that's consistent with various reports of human-like ETs. Also, in the cave where Padmasambhava meditated and achieved enlightenment, he pushed his hand into the rock, as I showed you in previous episodes, and it very undeniably is a six-fingered hand. And that is totally consistent with the beings that we saw in the Roswell crash. So Padmasambhava may very well have been from the same group of ETs that crashed in Roswell. They have 6 fingers, they look sort of like us, but they don't have eyebrows, they don't have hair on their heads, and the PTs that crashed in Roswell. They have 6 fingers, they look sort of like us, but they don't have eyebrows, they don't have hair on their heads, and apparently they also have these really amazing abilities. So Padmasambhava came in and took what Buddha had started with and further refined it into a set of spiritual teachings that led to a path for ascension. Some of the more controversial aspects of this, as I've been saying to you before, is that it included tantric sexual practices in which people would have prolonged sexual intercourse, but then they would be meditating as they do it. And this would also occur in these beautiful areas in the Himalayan mountains where you have an incredible view. And supposedly, these practices, at least in Padmasambhava's time, would greatly accelerate your ascension path. You can cultivate and enhance your vital energy or your chi through these types of practices. And that is something that some people are still trying to do that now, but a lot of the stuff that you hear about with Tantra these days seems to kind of sound like less than fully virtuous, people that are having these sex parties and that kind of stuff, which I'm not saying that's what you should be doing. But I do think in the context of a mated, monogamous relationship, that if you can practice some of these meditative exercises, you might actually get a lot of spiritual growth in a short time. And in fact, the Law of One talks extensively about sacred sexuality and how to activate those higher centers by meditating while you are engaged in that practice. So there's a lot of nice parallels here. So the Tibetans were able to hear what Padmasambhava had to say, and they actually got so spiritually activated by following his practices that they were literally flying around in groups. People were seeing groups of human beings literally flying through the air like a flock of birds. Padmasambhava did incredible things. As I said before, he could do these manifestations where he would merge rock in such a way that forms would emerge from the rock like a sculpture. He could do it spontaneously, handprints, footprints in the rocks, all that kind of stuff. And there was also a lot of this mentioned in my book, The Ascension Mysteries. That is something that brings it all back around, these teachings of ascension, something that everybody should be aware of. What I wrote in there, really, I've never seen anything else like it. The cosmic history of our solar system, the science of ascension, and the first half of the book is deceptively simple because I talk about what I went through as a soul to become aware of the spiritual truth. And so I start out as a very spiritual kid, but then I fall really deep into the darkness. And I do that on purpose so that if somebody is going through a dark night of the soul, even if it's as dark as mine, you might still be able to then see how much more you could ascend through that. And I do believe that in Buddhist teaching and everywhere else, we're born into a world of suffering. We have to go through suffering before we learn to transcend it. And so even when you're in what appears to be the darkest and the most confusing and scary part of your life, you can still come out the other side. You can still evolve. Every soul is ascending. Every soul is ultimately going to return to the oneness. Nobody ever gets lost. Nobody ever gets trashed or dumped by the universe or abandoned. We're all on a path. And there's always helpers that are trying to guide us to get to the next level. So some people say, oh, David just wanted to talk about himself. I did not want to write about my personal stories like I did. That was very painful. It was very traumatic. I only just now, in the last week, went back and reread the first half of the book, and I was able to do it without getting triggered because I've now processed those memories enough. But the point is, we're all emotions. You stay in a meditative, loving consciousness, and the Tibetans have said, if you can spend 13 years having nothing but a loving thought, you get to ascend whenever you want. Obviously, that's not going to happen to most of us. That's not how this game is usually played. So as I was saying, the book by Namkhai Norbu is the first book that turned me onto this, Dream Yoga and the Practice of Natural Light, where they talk about this rainbow body activation. You meditate on this, which is called the Tigli, and that's part of what you do. You concentrate on that symbol, which is the Sanskrit vowel ah. You actually tone that sound. And another really, really key point worth reminding us of is that Father Francis Tiso, on behalf of Institute of Noetic Sciences actually traveled to Tibet and witnessed a man in modern times today, this man Khenpo Achos, actually transforming into a rainbow body. And you leave behind this little ashy figurine, and in previous episodes I showed you many of those. There's lots of footprints you can see all throughout Tibet, allegedly of masters putting their feet into rock. They are able to do that once they reach a high enough vibration. I'll show you just a few of them again right here. This one is called the Pima Wangyal footprint, and this is one that is, you can go into the temple and see it there. You see how the foot just mushes into the rock like it poses no resistance. Another one here is Lama Dorje Sangwa, and here these two guys are posing next to it, and we're going to get a closer up view of it now. We zoom in on it a little bit. You can sure enough see there is a footprint mushed into the rock, and again, people witnessed this stuff. So it wasn't like somebody faked this. These were eyewitness things that happened with crowds of people around. Another one is from Milarepa Buddha, and you can see it right here. The Milarepa footprint, again, that looks kind of smaller, but it's the same idea, the footprint in the rock. Another one, Jingten Sumgon at Drikum Gompa, and that one is very, very nice and symmetrical. So sometimes that apparently happens at Drikum Gompa, and that one is very, very nice and symmetrical. So sometimes that apparently happens as well. A very good imprint. Now, I want to close out this episode and launch us back into the discussion of interplanetary climate change is going to prove all this stuff by sharing with you a very important quote from William Henry and Dr. Mark Gray in William Henry's book, and they wrote it together on the light body. I quoted this in, I believe, Source Field Investigations is totally worthy of repetition right here, because it shows how ubiquitous this concept of the light body is in all the different traditions that I've been showing you. They all have the same idea. So here we go. In Sufism, this light body is called the most sacred body or the super celestial body. And again, those are people getting it through Islam. Taoists call it the diamond body. And those who have attained it are called the immortals and the cloud walkers because they literally can fly through the clouds. Yogic schools and tantrics call it the divine body. In Kriya Yoga, it is called the body of bliss, the same thing. In Vedanta, it is called the superconductive body. The ancient Egyptians called it the luminous body or being, Ak, or the Karas. So it shows up in Egyptian scripture too, and we saw that. This conception evolved into Gnosticism, where they refer to it as the radiant body, this idea of a mass awakening, shower of sparks. In Mithraism, it is called the perfect body. We covered that and how the sun is going to do its thing in Mithraism. In the Hermetic corpus, that's again Egyptian, it is called the immortal body. In the alchemical tradition, the emerald tablets refer to it as the golden body. Okay, so now, after all this time and all these prophecies, there's a lot more prophecies. There's a lot more prophecies we could go through, and I'm going to do more of those in the future because we've only covered the ancient stuff. But first, before we do the more modern prophecies of ascension, I'm going to take you through a module now, a series of episodes where I'm going to show you all of the scientific proof that we need to establish that there is an interplanetary climate change going on. The sun, the earth, the moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, you name it, they're all doing outrageous, outrageous things. And this together, this body of evidence is absolutely incontrovertible proof that the solar system is going through an energetic state. We started to talk about the work of Dr. Alexei Dmitriev before, but that was Russian science. I went back and I found all of that data in NASA. So we're going to be getting into that interplanetary climate change and all of the amazing scientific details coming up next time here on Wisdom Teachings, where I am bringing you the knowledge you need that will set you free. Thanks for watching.